time, if you would give your attention to Mr. Brown on behalf of the family. Counselor?
Good morning. Jonathan Richardson loved Helen Reyes and her wonderful daughter Tegan. He wanted the three of them to start the perfect family. But Jonathan had been damaged by years of abuse, uncontrolled anger, and untreated mental problems. And when he tried to take care of Tegan over a 10-day period, the result was unbelievably tragic. Jonathan never intended to kill Tegan, and he never sexually assaulted her. But out of anger, he caused the injury that killed her. When Jonathan realized that Tegan had been seriously injured, he rushed her to the hospital. He was desperately trying to save her. Although Jonathan had inflicted the wound upon Tegan's head that would eventually kill her, it was never his intent to kill her. He loved Tegan. He thought of her as his daughter. He wanted Tegan, her mother Helen, and him to make up the perfect family. And so he rushed Tegan to the hospital in a desperate but ultimately failed attempt to save her. During this trial, you're going to hear evidence about what happened to Tegan and about how she died. But the evidence will raise other important questions. Why did this happen? Why would Jonathan inflict the fatal wound upon the little girl he loved as his daughter when he was never trying to kill her? How did his desire to have the perfect family end up so tragically? In order to understand all of this, this trial will take a look at Jonathan's life, his family, and his mental makeup. When Jonathan Richardson was born, the outside world may have believed that he was part of the perfect family. Jonathan was the first and only child of Doug and Sandy Richardson. His parents were married and middle class. But you will hear that this was hardly the perfect family. In fact, this was a family where the mother hired a hitman to kill the father. When Jonathan was 1 year old, he was contacted by a man interested. When Jonathan was 1 year old, his father was contacted by a man interested in buying a dog. The man came to the Richardsons' home and was invited in by Doug. The man, Lewis Smith, known as Big Luke, took out a gun and shot Doug 3 times. One of the bullets ended up in Doug's head, right near the brain. Somehow Doug survived and was rushed to Duke Hospital. And when the police investigated the case, they soon discovered what had happened. Big Luke had been hired to kill Doug Richardson. And the person who was behind hiring him to kill Doug Richardson was Sandy Richardson, who was Doug's wife and Jonathan's mom. While they were at the hospital, Sandy Richardson was arrested for conspiracy to murder and felonious assault upon her husband. A year later, she was tried for his attempted murder. She was found not guilty. After the trial, the parents broke up and Sandy Richardson filed for divorce. The question of custody was heard by a judge in Johnson County, and he concluded that Sandy Richardson had in fact arranged for her husband to be shot. He found that she was using drugs, had engaged in extramarital affairs, and had lied to the court. The court therefore gave primary custody of Jonathan to Doug, but the court gave Sandy custody of their child every other weekend. And therefore, Jonathan was raised by 2 different parents. By his father, who was damaged by the failed attempt to have him murdered, and by his mother, who was dealing with her own mental problems. Doug Richardson had recovered physically from the bullets that threatened to take his life, but the shooting left him mentally scarred. He was given the responsibility of raising a 3-year-old boy. Anyone who went through what he went through was going to need some type of mental health help. But Doug Richardson never got any. The results were that he was incapable of raising a young boy like Jonathan. Instead of providing him the type of care he needed, he largely neglected his only child. But when he did pay attention to him, it was even worse. Doug would get angry, and he would have physically abused his son. But at least when Jonathan was beaten, he knew his father cared. His father was paying attention. Sadly, Jonathan was taught that physical abuse was what a parent did. It was how a parent showed he cared, how he showed that he loved. You will hear evidence that many children go throughout their young lives being abused and nobody ever finds out about it. But in Jonathan Richardson's case, the authorities were alerted that something was not right. When Jonathan was in kindergarten, his mother called the Department of Social Services, often called DSS, and reported that Jonathan was being abused by his father. Speak to his son, but refused to let the social worker talk to him in private. Doug told the social worker that he had never beaten Jonathan before. The social worker had Doug sign a contract where he agreed not to whip Jonathan with a belt anymore and to try alternative methods of discipline. The social worker realized he may not have gotten the full story about what happened during the meeting at the Richardsons, so he went to Jonathan's school. He interviewed Jonathan, and he learned a lot more. Jonathan admitted that his bruises did not come from a skating accident. They had come from his father. Doug Richardson had denied ever beating Jonathan beforehand, but Jonathan informed the social worker that it happened every week. Sometimes Jonathan would be beaten on the leg. Sometimes he'd be beaten on the face. Sometimes it was with a hand. Sometimes it was with a belt. The social worker told Jonathan that his father had agreed not to discipline him with a belt anymore, and the kindergartner said, "I doubt it." The evidence would show that this is a case that should not have fallen through the cracks. There were plenty of flags for the Department of Social Services to review, including actual bruises, a hostile father who lied throughout the interview, and a child who talked about abuse in the past and concerns about the future. And of course, if they investigated further, they would have learned that this was a family that had been rocked by domestic violence, because the mother had hired a hitman to kill the father. DSS had found the abuse had occurred, but this was their response. They sent Doug Richardson and Sandy Creech form letters telling them that neglect had been substantiated in the case. They did not offer any services of any type to the Richardson family, and they told Jonathan, the kindergarten, that if the abuse continued in the future, by all means, he should tell his guidance counselor about it. That marked the last time that any agency looked into the Richardson family. But the DSS intervention, such as it was, did not stop the abuse, did not stop the neglect, and did not stop the isolation that Jonathan felt. Soon Doug Richardson would move in with another woman named Sandy Penny. Sandy Penny had 2 children who were significantly older than Jonathan. The merging of these 2 families did not end the abuse or neglect. Doug ended up having even less time to pay attention to his only child, but he still had plenty of time to abuse Jonathan, and Jonathan's isolation only continued. Jonathan would spend every other weekend with his mother, but that was hardly a relief from the abuse and neglect that he received from his father. Sandy Richardson had her own serious untreated mental health problems, which manifested itself in arranging the shooting of her husband. After she and Doug Richardson split up, she had multiple relationships and went through multiple marriages. Dealing with this mental illness and relationships left her little time to provide the type of care and attention that any child would need. During her time with his mother, Jonathan's isolation and neglect simply continued. The signs of Jonathan's abuse, neglect, and isolation continued as he headed towards high school. His father quit sending him to a doctor. Jonathan was at one point in advanced classes, but when his test scores slipped, the school sent a note home saying Jonathan would be moved from the program. His father did not respond. The school did nothing about it. In high school, his friends began noticing his personality was beginning to change. He was becoming angry, especially if he'd been drinking. People were worried about it, but nobody did anything about it. The school remained silent. His family ignored the problems. Getting the complete picture of Jonathan's childhood is not an easy task. Jonathan has no siblings, and there is no one who can tell us exactly what he was going through. He has no lifetime friends growing up. The same family problems that haunted the members of his family while he was growing up and prevented them from giving Jonathan the type of love and attention every child needs continues to this day. As a result, you will hear their ability to assist in presenting the story of his life has been affected. But from different witnesses, documents, and expert witnesses, in this case, you will begin to get a picture of what Jonathan's life was like as a child and how that affected him when he was trying to care for Tegan. A psychiatrist, Dr. Donna Schwartz-Watts, has examined Jonathan, reviewed the records in this case, and has extensively studied his background. Based on all this, she has learned about how his background has affected him and how it contributed to what happened to Tegan. You will hear from Dr. Schwartz, and from that you will begin to understand that Jonathan was never trying to kill Tegan, and that Jonathan never had any sexual intent with Tegan. Rather, that Jonathan's actions were affected by his history of abuse, anger, and his mental problems. In December of 2009, Jonathan met Helen Reyes. The two of them hit it off immediately and became a couple. By June of 2010, they were living together. Also living with them was Helen's wonderful daughter, Tegan. In June of 2010, Helen was a 27-year-old soldier in the Army Reserves. She had raised Tegan since birth. Jonathan, meanwhile, was 21 years old, was living with his grandparents, and never been around children for any significant amount of time. When Helen, Jonathan, and Tegan moved in together, they moved into a building in Jonathan's grandparents' backyard. The building that they moved in has been called a barn, but it was no barn. It was a shed. A shed that would be good for storing stuff in. A shed that would be that was used by his grandparents for exercise equipment, and it was good for that purpose. But it was not a place for two people to live in. And it certainly was not the place for a couple and a small child to live in. It was small. It did not have running water. And the only bed for the three of them to live on was a single air mattress. Helen moved in with Jonathan because that was what Helen wanted. Helen brought Tegan to stay with them because that's what Helen wanted to do. And Helen agreed to live in a shed because that is what Helen wanted to do. During this trial, you're going to hear a lot of evidence about the horrific abuse that Tegan suffered. But let's be clear about this. Tegan was being abused before Helen ever left her daughter with Jonathan. Helen taught Jonathan that abusing her daughter was appropriate by her actions or by her approval when it happened. As part of her duties with the Army Reserves, Helen was required to go to training in New Mexico during July. She was supposed to be gone for 2 weeks. Helen, of course, needed somebody to watch Tegan while she was gone. She could have left Tegan with her mother. In fact, she had an agreement with the military that said she was going to leave Tegan with her mother while she was gone for things like training. But Helen did not want her mother watching Tegan. She could have let Tegan stay with Tegan's paternal grandparents. Tegan had stayed with Gerald and Sarah Skiba when she was younger, and her grandparents loved her dearly. They would have loved to watch Tegan while Helen was gone, but Helen didn't want them watching after Tegan. Helen had other family members and friends who could have taken care of Tegan, but Helen didn't want any of them watching after Tegan. only one she wanted to watch after Tegan was Jonathan. She had Jonathan watch Tegan even though he had no experience watching a child. She had him take care of Tegan despite the abuse. She had him take care of Tegan despite the fact they were living in a shed with no running water and with only a single air mattress. Jonathan ended up caring for Tegan because that's what Helen Reyes wanted. So in early July, Helen went to New Mexico and left Jonathan as the sole caretaker for Tegan. Jonathan loved Tegan, but he was as unequipped to care for a 4-year-old as a 21-year-old man could be. He had no idea how to take care of a little girl, and his actions showed it. At first he would go to work in the morning, leaving Tegan in the shed by herself. The evidence will show this was not out of maliciousness. It was because he just didn't know any better. You're going to see videotape that shows that Jonathan would go shopping and run other errands while Tegan was home alone. Who would leave a 4-year-old alone by herself in a shed while they went shopping? The evidence will show that it was someone who had no idea the very basics of what you're supposed to do when you're watching a child. And Jonathan's complete lack of understanding of what a parent was supposed to do can be shown by pictures that were recovered from Jonathan's camera. The cameras will have pictures of Tegan at the aquarium and Tegan fishing with Jonathan. But intermingled with these pictures are photographs that depict and document abuse. While most abusive parents would hide their abusive treatment of their children, Jonathan photographed what happened because he had no idea what he was doing was wrong. Eventually, Jonathan was told he could not continue to go to work while he had a 4-year-old living with him. And that left... That left Tegan and Jonathan living together. And what happened when the two of them were there by themselves is beyond horrific. We are not here to justify and excuse the injuries that Tegan got during this time. But Jonathan did not hurt Tegan for the purposes of persuasion, punishment, or sadistic pleasure. What happened to Tegan during this period happened because Jonathan had uncontrollable anger. It happened because Jonathan had no idea how to deal with his anger and his mental problems. It happened because everything he had learned about how to deal with a child had come from a damaged Doug Richardson, a mentally ill Sandy Creech, and from Helen Reyes. As horrible as what happened to Tegan was, the evidence in this case will show several things about what happened. Jonathan at no point ever wanted to kill Tegan. Also, he never sexually assaulted her. As bad as the injuries were, there was never a sexual intent by Jonathan at any time. Jonathan's actions were caused by anger and mental problems. You will learn during this trial that although Tegan suffered many horrendous injuries, only the injury to her head caused her death. Tegan died from a blow to the head, and the injury to her head happened at a separate time and a separate day from her other injuries. Like so much of this case, the injury that would kill Tegan was tragic. Once again, Jonathan's anger got the best of him, and he grabbed her and he shook her and hit her head against the wall. He was not trying to kill her. He never used any type of deadly weapon. He wasn't even trying to hurt her. But his anger, his history of abuse, and his mental illness tragically got the best of him. Perhaps most parents would have immediately realized how hurt Tegan was when she hit the wall, but Jonathan did not have the parenting skills, experience, or insight to realize just how hurt Tegan was. It was only the next morning that he began to realize how hurt Tegan was. And as soon as he did, he called Helen to tell her that he needed to take Tegan to the hospital.
Objection, Your Honor.
At first, Helen told him not to take Tegan to the hospital. She did not want them to get into any trouble. Finally, Jonathan convinced Helen to let him take Tegan to the hospital. And so he rushed Tegan to the hospital in a desperate attempt to save her, the little girl he loved as his daughter, but who his history of abuse, his anger, and his mental problems had caused him to fatally injure. When he got to the hospital, he was soon interrogated by the police and his mother and talked about what happened to his father and to Helen. Most of these conversations were recorded by a video camera. And during these conversations, you will hear that Jonathan has no explanation for what happened and why. So he told many lies. Silly, stupid lies that anyone could see would be easily disproved. But throughout these conversations, you will learn that some things he said were true. He never wanted to kill Tegan. He didn't understand what happened, why what happened, and he truly loved Tegan. When the police searched the shed, they found plenty of evidence that will be introduced during this case. The evidence will show that Jonathan left the shed to take care of Tegan. When Jonathan left the shed to take Tegan to the hospital, he made no effort to cover up or hide anything that he had done to Tegan. What happened to Tegan is truly heartbreaking. Her injuries are horrific. Her death is unbelievably tragic. In this trial, we're not going to try to diminish any of that. We will not justify what happened to Tegan. But Jonathan never intended to kill Tegan. He is not guilty of first-degree murder under any theory of first-degree murder. He did not sexually assault her. And so we will ask you to keep an open mind until you have heard all the evidence. And at the end of this case, we are going to ask you to find Jonathan not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of kidnapping, and not guilty of sex offense.
Members of the jury, before we hear from our first witness, there are a couple of legal issues I need to discuss with the lawyers outside of your presence. My best estimate is it'll take about 5 minutes. I'm going to ask you to simply step back to the jury deliberation room and stay there. Please do not discuss the case while you're back there. Keep your minds open, abide by my other instructions. And for information and planning purposes, we'll break for lunch sometime today around 12:30 or no later than about 12:45. All right, jurors are excused. Outside the presence of our jurors, first I will hear from the state if there's anything the state would like to say for the record with regard to its objections lodged during the defendant's opening statement. Mr. Butler, anything you'd like to say?
I think the last one, I believe, was in reference to the issue that I brought up before the court on Wednesday, and the fact that, at least on the evidence, unless the defendant will testify, the statements that